Bienvenue dans Décryptage. En raison du changement climatique, du conflit entre l'Ukraine et la Russie et de la pandémie de Covid-19, le nombre de personnes souffrant de malnutrition chronique et incapables de satisfaire leurs besoins de consommation alimentaire de base a augmenté d'au moins 30% pour atteindre 123 millions en 2022, soit 12% de la population de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Le 15 septembre 2022, le Fonds monétaire international a publié un rapport sur le changement climatique et l'insécurité alimentaire chronique en Afrique subsaharienne. Pour donner un aperçu de cette étude et faire l'état des lieux de la sécurité alimentaire en Afrique subsaharienne, nous recevons dans cette édition le chef de division adjoint au département Afrique du Fonds monétaire international, Pritha Mitra. Pritha Mitra, chef de division adjoint au département Afrique du Fonds monétaire international, merci d'être présente sur Africa 24. Le Fonds monétaire international a publié le 15 septembre 2022 un rapport sur le changement climatique et l'insécurité alimentaire chronique en Afrique subsaharienne. Les pays d'Afrique subsaharienne doivent-ils craindre l'apparition d'une crise alimentaire chronique?
Thank you for speaking with me today about this pressing topic. In fact, currently there are over 123 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who suffer from chronic food insecurity. That means they don't have access to enough food to meet their basic consumption needs, and they suffer from malnutrition. And of course, with the war in Ukraine and the pandemic over the last 2 years, these events have increased food prices and depressed incomes, which has raised food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa by almost 30% compared to where it was 2 years ago before the pandemic. Food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa has been rising for the last several years and faster than in the rest of the world. In fact, it's the most food insecure region of the world. Think about the floods right now in Chad, or the severe drought, it's record-breaking in East Africa. What happens with these climate events and other climate events is not only are lives and livelihoods taken, food distribution routes are disrupted, and crops are destroyed. And with insufficient food, children suffer from malnutrition, they aren't able to finish their educations, and ultimately it reduces their earnings potential. So the effect can be very severe in the near term and for many years to come. As climate change continues to intensify, the risk of increasing food insecurity and all these consequences I just mentioned increases. So it's a very urgent situation for the region.
La situation d'insécurité alimentaire en Afrique subsaharienne est-elle aussi alarmante au regard des effets du changement climatique?
Yes, as I said, the number of food insecure people are growing with each climate shock, whether it's a flood or a drought. And the question really is, why is it so? And why is this happening, right? And as you mentioned, people are being displaced. It could result in more conflict across the region, fighting for water or land. And so the reason that the region is so vulnerable to climate change is really a lack of resilience. And to give you just an example, think about how more than half the population depends on farming, some sort of farming, whether it's on land or fishing or herding. And meanwhile, they can't afford the infrastructure to protect them from the adverse effects of climate change. So if you think about a farmer, most of the farmers depend on rain-fed agriculture. So they depend on the rain to water their crops. They can't afford irrigation. And even if they could afford irrigation, where's the electricity to power it? So this is, just as an example of how pressing it is and some of the reasons behind it. This is an example of a lack of resilience. Or if you think about food distribution, there aren't enough flood barriers or roads that can withstand severe weather, right? And so if a road is broken, the food can't get to different communities across a given country.
Le rapport du FMI présente les effets du changement climatique sur la capacité des pays africains à produire ou à maintenir leur productivité. 85% de la nourriture consommée dans certaines régions provient d'importations. Quelle stratégie adoptée par les pays africains pour mieux s'adapter à la situation actuelle?
The report is looking at how to improve the resilience of sub-Saharan Africa to climate change. And that means how can they produce more food of their own, right? And how can they more easily distribute the food? So the question again is what can be done about it? Governments are already doing quite a lot, but their efforts would benefit from being more targeted. So they could have a much greater impact if they focus their efforts on things like social assistance and resilient infrastructure. So to give you an example, our analysis actually finds that targeted social assistance, such as cash transfers, are more than twice as effective at protecting the poor compared to agricultural production subsidies when people are facing a given food price shock. So that's just one example, but there are other areas as well, like resilient infrastructure. I mentioned earlier things like flood barriers and roads, irrigation, the electricity to power it. Electricity also powers storage and temperature control for the storage, right? Which is super important if you need to keep some food stocks. And then there's other types of infrastructure too, like digitalization, which are super important because digitalization provides early warning systems to farmers. It facilitates farmers to use mobile banking, and it gives farmers an opportunity to use mobile platforms to contact vendors directly. So the result of that is lower food prices for consumers because you cut out the middle person, and higher profits for the farmers. So some key areas of resilient infrastructure can make a huge difference. But aside from that, because cash transfers and infrastructure are expensive for the government, there's a lot the government can do without spending anything, such as streamlining regulations. For example, in Kenya, by streamlining regulations related to resilient seeds, they actually managed to multiply the availability by several times of resilient seeds. So then another area is trade liberalization. Think about export bans that have been in place or are still in place in many countries of region. So as an example, a country that has an export ban that produces a lot of maize, the year they have a really good harvest of maize, a lot of that excess maize goes to waste when it could actually have been exported to neighboring countries who were facing shortages at the same time, right? So trade liberalization and also better infrastructure that links the countries can help regional trade integration, which would ultimately stabilize food prices and food supply for the region. And along those lines, the private sector can help too with improved access to finance, right? With better access to finance, farmers can purchase more food. They can also produce more food because that allows them to invest in technology and machinery that would help them expand their production.
Des pays comme la Somalie, le Kenya, le Tchad ou encore l'Éthiopie ont connu des situations difficiles dues aux effets du changement climatique. Vous avez travaillé en République démocratique du Congo qui perd chaque année environ 6 000 mètres carrés de sa superficie à cause de ce fléau. et vous avez également travaillé sur la question de la prévention de l'insécurité alimentaire dans le cadre de l'une de vos dernières publications. Comment l'Afrique peut-elle échapper à l'insécurité alimentaire chronique dans un contexte climatique? Pouvez-vous partager avec nous les principales conclusions de cette étude?
So actually, in my previous answer, I kind of outlined some of the main policies.
Yes.
And gave an example of how things like social cash transfers can actually have a huge impact. So, linking back to my previous answer, if you think about infrastructure, so things like better roads or better trains and ports and so on, railway, all of this that would help transport and improve regional integration, trade integration, as well as irrigation infrastructure. Each of those pieces of infrastructure, let's say, is again twice as effective as agricultural subsidies for a given food price increase. So I think the key message here is really going back again to my previous answer, our main finding is that government intervention needs to be more targeted. And it needs to be targeted at key pieces of resilient infrastructure, at things like social cash transfers, and also at just streamlining a lot of regulation that prevents farmers from better being able to access or at lower cost access water, seeds. All these things are needed to improve the production and distribution of the region.
La mise en place de politiques fiscales et financières, notamment la numérisation ou les transferts sociaux en espèces, serait un préalable à l'adaptation aux effets du changement climatique. Comment les pays africains peuvent-ils mettre en œuvre de telles politiques et comment peuvent-ils contribuer concrètement aux efforts d'adaptation au changement climatique?
Yeah, so I think very importantly, it's not that African countries, the governments, the policymakers are not aware of these things, and many of the countries have included these elements in their climate strategies, in their food security strategies, their development strategies. Our report just serves to highlight how effective some of these strategies could be, some of these aspects of the strategies could be, and to help prioritize the various policies, because one of the challenges is that there are too many ideas, and they're good ideas, but it's a matter of figuring out which ones will have the greatest impact. So the areas I just mentioned in my earlier answers help outline which areas might have the biggest impact. But having said that, there's still one challenge, big challenge that remains, is that how will African countries pay for this? Infrastructure is very expensive. So, and yes, of course, countries are making efforts for domestic revenue mobilization, but that has its limits. And countries are also now coming out of the pandemic with high debt levels. So ultimately, development partner support is very urgently needed. And that's support in terms of financing, but also capacity development and transfer of technology and know-how. So a lot of research can be done on what would be the best resilient seeds for particular regions of Africa, for example. So there are many areas where development partners can help, and this is really going to be the key to actually being able to implement these reforms.
Le Fonds monétaire international s'investit-il concrètement pour aider les pays africains à mettre en œuvre ces stratégies afin de s'adapter et de renforcer leur résilience face au changement climatique et à l'insécurité alimentaire?
Yes, the IMF is actually working actively with sub-Saharan African countries. And in fact, we now have been working with our partners in the region to put in place climate-oriented capacity development. So we have many different areas of this, which include in public financial management. So it helps countries eventually help themselves to be able to prioritize, for example, across investment projects, infrastructure projects, and so on. So we have different types of capacity development that are helping with that. And ultimately, improvements in those areas also help unlock a lot of financing, for example, from climate funds and directly from development partners. So that's one area. Another area is our lending facilities. We have a variety of lending facilities which we're using to support several sub-Saharan African countries, and one of our latest facilities that will soon be operational is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has a specific focus on climate change and helping improve resilience, a long-term resilience. And by doing so, food security and climate, and in the sense that it's linked to climate change, is a part of that.
Pritha Mitra, chef de division adjoint au département Afrique du Fonds monétaire international, merci d'avoir accepté notre invitation. Merci à vous d'avoir suivi ce décryptage. L'information continue sur Africa 24.